Birmingham, Alabama, March 17, 1957. Elvis Presley stood backstage at the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium, adjusting his jacket, preparing to walk out in front of 10,000 screaming fans. He was 22 years old, at the absolute peak of his early fame, with hit records dominating the charts and teenagers across America obsessed with everything he did. But Elvis didn't know something that the FBI knew, something that his security team knew, something that had been kept from him until the last possible moment because they were afraid he would cancel the show. At that very moment, somewhere in the audience of 10,000 people, there were 3 men with guns, men who had traveled from different cities, men who had coordinated through secret meetings and coded messages, men who belonged to a white supremacist organization that had decided Elvis Presley needed to die. Their plan was simple and brutal. During the third song of Elvis's set, when he would be center stage under the spotlight, when the screaming would be at its loudest, when security would be focused on controlling the crowd, all 3 men would stand, draw their weapons, and fire simultaneously. They had studied his movements. They knew his set list. They had practiced their timing. They believed they couldn't miss. The FBI had discovered this plot just 48 hours earlier through an informant. They had tried to convince Elvis to cancel, but Elvis had refused. Now, as he stood backstage waiting for his introduction, FBI agents in plain clothes were scattered throughout the audience, desperately trying to identify the 3 assassins before the music started. In 15 minutes, Elvis Presley would either walk out on that stage and give a performance, or he would die on that stage in front of 10,000 witnesses. And nobody in that building, except for a handful of FBI agents and security personnel, had any idea what was about to happen. This is the story of the most dangerous hour in Elvis Presley's life, the assassination plot that came within seconds of succeeding, the white supremacist conspiracy that wanted the king of rock and roll dead, and the FBI investigation that would remain classified for decades. If you want to discover how Elvis survived, who tried to kill him, why this story was buried for so long, and what really happened that night in Birmingham, subscribe to our channel. This is the complete story, told for the first time with declassified FBI documents, eyewitness testimonies, and the truth that has been hidden for over 60 years. To understand why white supremacists wanted to assassinate Elvis Presley in 1957, you have to understand what Elvis represented to them. He wasn't just a musician. He was a symbol of everything they believed was destroying white America. By March 1957, Elvis had been a national phenomenon for about a year. He had appeared on Ed Sullivan's show, where the camera had famously only filmed him from the waist up because his hip movements were considered too sexual, too provocative. His records were selling in unprecedented numbers. Teenagers were buying Elvis merchandise, copying his hairstyle, imitating his moves. But to segregationists in the South, Elvis was something far more dangerous than a popular entertainer. He was a white man performing what they considered Negro music in a style they associated with black culture. He was breaking down the racial barriers that segregation was designed to maintain. He was making it acceptable for white teenagers to appreciate and participate in black cultural forms. And perhaps most dangerously from their perspective, he had refused to denounce black music or black artists. In that infamous September 1956 television interview in Jackson, Mississippi, Elvis had walked off the set rather than say that black people and their music were inferior. That moment had made him a hero to some and a traitor to others. White supremacist organizations across the South had been watching Elvis with growing alarm. The Citizens Councils, sometimes called the Uptown Klan, had organized boycotts of his music. Radio stations had banned his records. Churches had condemned him from the pulpit, but none of it had slowed his rise to fame. By early 1957, some extremist groups had reached a darker conclusion. Elvis Presley couldn't be boycotted or banned into irrelevance. He was too popular, too successful, too culturally significant. The only way to stop what he represented was to eliminate him physically. The specific organization behind the 1957 assassination plot was called the White Citizens Defense League, a splinter group that had broken away from the main Citizens Council because they believed the council wasn't militant enough. The WCDL believed in direct action, in violence if necessary, to preserve white supremacy. Their leader was a man named Thomas Whitfield, a 47-year-old former insurance salesman from Montgomery, Alabama. He had become radicalized after the Montgomery bus boycott, which he saw as the beginning of the end for the Southern way of life. He had connections to various Klan chapters across the state and had been involved in several incidents of racial violence, though he had never been successfully prosecuted.
In January 1957, Whitfield called a meeting of the WCDL's Inner Circle. About 20 men attended, gathering in a barn outside Birmingham. The purpose of the meeting was explicit: to discuss direct action against what Whitfield called race traitors and Negro lovers. Elvis Presley was at the top of their list. Whitfield argued that killing Elvis would send a message that couldn't be ignored. It would show that white men who betrayed their race would face consequences. It would strike fear into other entertainers who might be tempted to cross racial lines, and it would be a public spectacle that would demonstrate the power of their movement. Not everyone at the meeting agreed with assassination. Some argued it would bring too much law enforcement attention, would create a martyr, would be counterproductive. But Whitfield had a response. Sometimes you have to accept casualties to win a war. And make no mistake, we are at war for the soul of the white race. By the end of the meeting, 3 men had volunteered for what they called the Birmingham operation. Their names were James Tucker, 34, a construction worker from Tuscaloosa; Robert Mills, 29, an unemployed factory worker from Montgomery; and Carl Henderson, 42, a mechanic from Birmingham. These 3 men were chosen because they had weapons experience, because they had proven their commitment to the cause through previous acts of violence and intimidation, and because they were willing to accept the consequences. They understood they would likely be caught, would probably spend the rest of their lives in prison, or possibly face execution. They believed their sacrifice would be worth it. Over the next 6 weeks, Tucker, Mills, and Henderson met regularly to plan the operation. They studied Elvis's touring schedule and determined that the Birmingham show on March 17th would be their target. Birmingham was a home territory where they had support networks. The venue was large enough that they could blend into the crowd, and symbolically, striking in Birmingham, the heart of segregationist resistance, would amplify their message. They purchased 3.38 caliber revolvers through black market contacts. They obtained tickets through different sellers so their purchases wouldn't be connected. They rehearsed their timing, practiced drawing and firing their weapons, coordinated their positions in the venue so they would create a triangulated field of fire. The plan was for each man to enter the venue separately, to sit in different sections, to avoid any contact with each other that might draw suspicion. During the 3rd song of Elvis's set, which their research indicated would be Hound Dog, Tucker would stand first and fire. Mills would fire 2 seconds later. Henderson would fire 2 seconds after that. 3 guns, 3 shooters, staggered timing to create confusion, all aimed at a single target under a spotlight on an open stage. They believed Elvis would have no chance of survival. What they didn't know was that one of the 20 men at that January meeting was an FBI informant. His name was Marcus Wright, and he had been placed in the White Citizens Defense League 6 months earlier as part of the FBI's COINTELPRO operations targeting domestic extremist groups. Wright had sat through that entire January meeting, listening to them plan Elvis Presley's murder, saying nothing that would compromise his cover. And the moment the meeting ended, he contacted his FBI handler with the details he had just observed. The FBI took the threat seriously from the moment they received Marcus Wright's report. This wasn't vague chatter or idle threats. This was an active conspiracy with specific targets, specific dates, specific methods. And the target was one of the most famous people in America. The case was assigned to Special Agent Frank Morrison, a 15-year FBI veteran who specialized in domestic terrorism and extremist groups. Morrison had worked cases involving Klan violence, had investigated bombings and assassinations, and understood how dangerous these groups could be when they moved from rhetoric to action. Morrison's first challenge was verification. He needed to confirm that this wasn't just talk, that these men were actually preparing to carry out the assassination. Wright had provided names, but Morrison needed evidence that would hold up in court and that would justify the extensive security operation he was planning. Over the next 4 weeks, from mid-January through mid-February 1957, Morrison's team conducted intensive surveillance on Tucker, Mills, and Henderson. They monitored their movements, documented their meetings, intercepted some of their communications. The evidence confirmed Wright's report. These men were serious, they were preparing, and they intended to follow through. On February 20th, 1957, Morrison's team observed Tucker and Mills at a shooting range outside Tuscaloosa practicing with handguns. The weapons matched the descriptions Wright had provided. The men fired at human-shaped targets, aiming for center mass, the kind of practice you'd expect from people preparing for an assassination. Morrison now had enough evidence to make arrests immediately. He could charge all 3 men with conspiracy, could shut down the plot before it got any closer to execution. But Morrison made a controversial decision. He would wait, would let the conspiracy continue, would allow the men to proceed to Birmingham. Morrison's reasoning was tactical. If he arrested the men now, he would disrupt this specific plot, but wouldn't dismantle the organization behind it. Thomas Whitfield and the rest of the WCDL leadership would remain free, would simply plan a different operation with different operatives. Morrison wanted to catch everyone, to use this assassination attempt as a way to destroy the entire organization.
But his decision meant allowing Elvis Presley to walk into a situation where assassins would be present, armed, and ready to kill him. It was a calculated risk that Morrison believed he could manage, but it was still a risk. On March 1st, Morrison finally briefed his superiors at FBI headquarters about the operation. He requested additional agents, requested authorization for the Birmingham operation, and requested permission to brief Elvis's security team without briefing Elvis himself. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally approved the operation, but added a specific instruction. Under no circumstances is Elvis Presley to be harmed. The Bureau cannot afford the public relations disaster of a famous entertainer being assassinated while under our protection. Morrison understood the stakes. If anything went wrong, if Elvis was hurt or killed, Morrison's career would be over, and the FBI would face devastating criticism. But he believed his plan would work. On March 10th, 1 week before the Birmingham show, Morrison traveled to Memphis to brief Elvis's security team. The team was led by Red West, Elvis's friend from high school, along with several other trusted associates who handled Elvis's personal protection. Morrison laid everything out: the plot, the plotters, the planned method and timing, the FBI surveillance, and the security plan for Birmingham. Red West's reaction was immediate and emphatic. "We cancel the show. We don't put Elvis in danger for any reason." But Morrison explained why canceling wasn't the right move. First, if Elvis canceled, the assassins would simply wait for another opportunity. The threat wouldn't go away. It would just be postponed. Second, canceling would signal to the WCDL that their tactics worked, that threatening violence could shut down performances, which would encourage more threats. And third,
Morrison needed the Birmingham show to proceed so he could arrest not just the 3 shooters, but the entire conspiracy. Red West wasn't convinced. "You're asking us to put Elvis on a stage where you know there are armed men planning to kill him? That's insane!" Morrison acknowledged the risk, but explained his security plan. FBI agents would be positioned throughout the venue, in plain clothes, specifically watching the areas where the 3 assassins had purchased tickets. The moment any of the 3 men made a move toward their weapons, agents would intervene, subduing the target before a shot could be fired. "And what if one of them changes seats?" West asked. "What if they change the plan? What if your intelligence is wrong?" Morrison didn't have perfect answers to those questions. Intelligence was never perfect. Plans could change. Variables existed. But he believed the operation could be executed safely, and he needed Elvis's team on board. After hours of discussion, Morrison made a promise. "If at any point I believe Elvis is in genuine danger, I will personally pull him off that stage. I give you my word." Red West reluctantly agreed to cooperate, but on one condition. Elvis wouldn't be told about the threat until absolutely necessary. Red West knew Elvis well enough to know that if he was told about an assassination plot, he might do something unpredictable, might confront the threat publicly, might change his performance in ways that could compromise security. Better to keep him unaware until after it was over. Morrison agreed. Elvis would perform not knowing that in the audience, 3 men were planning to kill him, and dozens of FBI agents were planning to stop them. The final 2 weeks before the Birmingham show were spent in meticulous preparation. Morrison's team expanded to 30 agents dedicated to the operation. They studied the venue layout, identified sight lines, planned entry and exit points, coordinated with local Birmingham police, though only the police chief was briefed on the specific threat. They also continued surveillance on Tucker, Mills, and Henderson, monitoring for any changes to their plan. On March 14th, 3 days before the show, the 3 men met one final time at a diner outside Birmingham. FBI agents with directional microphones captured their conversation. Tucker: "Everyone still committed?" Mills: "Absolutely." Henderson: "This is what we've been building to. This is our moment." Tucker: "Remember, wait for Hound Dog. 3rd song. I go first, then you, then you. Don't fire until you hear my shot." Mills: "What if security rushes the stage?" Tucker: "They'll be too late. We'll all get our shots off before they can react. Even if only one of us hits him, that's enough." Henderson: "For the white race." Tucker and Mills: "For the white race." Morrison listened to that recording and felt his stomach tighten. These men were serious, they were committed, and they would absolutely attempt to kill Elvis Presley if given the chance. The final briefing with the FBI team happened on March 16th, the day before the show. Morrison went over the plan one more time. Agents would be positioned throughout the venue, with specific agents assigned to each of the 3 assassins. The moment any of them moved to draw a weapon, the nearest agent would intervene physically, subduing the target before a shot could be fired. But Morrison had a backup plan too. He had positioned 3 FBI sharpshooters in the venue's upper catwalks, with clear sight lines to the stage and to the areas where the assassins had purchased tickets. The moment an assassin managed to draw a weapon, despite the close proximity agents, the sharpshooters were authorized to fire. It was the most elaborate security operation ever mounted for an entertainment event in American history, and it all depended on perfect timing, perfect coordination, and a lot of luck. On the morning of March 17th, Morrison received confirmation that all 3 assassins had checked into hotels in Birmingham. They were in position. The operation was happening. That evening, one way or another, the conspiracy would be resolved. Morrison called Red West one last time. "We're ready. How's Elvis?" "He's fine. Doesn't suspect anything. He thinks this is just another show." "Good. Let's keep it that way. See you tonight." Morrison hung up and looked at his team. "Gentlemen, we have one job tonight. Make sure Elvis Presley walks off that stage alive. No mistakes, no failures. Let's go."
March 17, 1957 began as a beautiful spring day in Birmingham. Elvis woke up in his hotel room at the Tutwiler Hotel around noon, which was typical for him when he was on tour. Late nights performing, late mornings recovering. His routine was to have breakfast, usually bacon, eggs, and toast, then spend the afternoon relaxing before the evening show. Red West knocked on Elvis's door around 1 p.m. You up? Elvis opened the door, hair disheveled, still in his pajamas. Yeah, man. What's the plan for today? Red tried to keep his voice casual, tried not to let Elvis sense the tension he was feeling. Nothing special? Thought we might get some food, maybe drive around a bit, kill some time before the show. Elvis nodded. Sounds good. Let me get cleaned up. As Elvis showered and dressed, Red West sat in the hotel room thinking about what he knew and what Elvis didn't. In a few hours, Elvis would walk onto a stage where 3 men with guns would be waiting to kill him. FBI agents would be scattered through the crowd trying to stop them, and Elvis had no idea any of this was happening. Red had argued with Agent Morrison about this. He believed Elvis had a right to know, that keeping him in the dark was wrong. But Morrison had been firm. If Elvis knows, he might change his behavior in ways we can't predict. He might try to address the threat directly, might say something from the stage, might do something that would compromise the operation. For his own safety, he's better off not knowing until after. Red understood the logic, but hated the deception. He and Elvis had been friends since high school. They'd grown up together, had been through everything together. Keeping something this important from Elvis felt like a betrayal. Elvis emerged from the bathroom dressed in casual clothes, jeans and a shirt. Ready to go? They left the hotel and drove around Birmingham, Elvis looking out the window at the city, making small talk, seemingly without a care in the world. They stopped at a diner for lunch, and Elvis charmed the waitresses, signed autographs for the people who recognized him, was his usual friendly self. Meanwhile, across the city, FBI agents were taking their positions at the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium. Agent Morrison was already there, walking the venue one more time, checking sight lines, confirming positions, making sure everything was ready. The auditorium could hold 10,000 people. By 3 p.m., ticket holders were already beginning to line up outside, hours before the doors would open. These were mostly teenagers, many of them girls, excited to see Elvis Presley in person. They had no idea that this show was different from any other Elvis performance, that tonight would be the most dangerous night in Elvis's career. At 4 p.m., Morrison received confirmation that all 3 assassins had been spotted in the vicinity of the venue. Tucker was seen parking his car 2 blocks away. Mills was observed walking past the auditorium, apparently scouting the area. Henderson had entered a bar across the street and ordered a drink, presumably to calm his nerves before the operation. Morrison radioed his team. All targets are in play. Stay alert. Remember, we don't move until they draw weapons. We need evidence of attempt, not just intent. This was the legally complicated part of Morrison's plan. He couldn't arrest the men for simply being at the venue with guns in their possession. Alabama was an open-carry state, and having a weapon wasn't illegal. He needed them to actually attempt the assassination, to draw their weapons with clear intent to shoot Elvis. Only then could he charge them with attempted murder and build a case against the entire WCDL organization. But waiting for that moment meant allowing the situation to become dangerous, meant bringing it right up to the edge of tragedy before pulling back. It was a calculated gamble that Morrison believed would work, but that kept him tense with anxiety. At 5 p.m., the venue doors opened. Fans flooded in, rushing for their seats, particularly the ones close to the stage. The general admission floor section quickly filled with teenagers who wanted to be as close to Elvis as possible. The assigned seating sections filled more slowly as people found their specific seats.
FBI agents watched as Tucker entered through the main entrance at 5:15 p.m. He was wearing a jacket despite the warm evening, almost certainly because he had a gun concealed underneath. He found his seat in Section C, about 40 feet from the stage, slightly to the right of center. Agent Patterson, who had been assigned to Tucker, took a position 3 rows behind him. Mills entered at 5:30 p.m., also wearing a jacket. His seat was in Section A, about 35 feet from the stage, to the left. Agent Rodriguez positioned himself 2 rows behind and 4 seats to the right, maintaining visual contact while not being directly obvious. Henderson was the last to enter, arriving at 5:45 p.m. His seat was in Section B, directly center, about 30 feet from the stage, the closest of the 3 to where Elvis would be performing. Agent Thompson took a position in the row behind him, close enough to intervene within seconds if necessary. Morrison watched from a position in the back of the venue, monitoring his team via radio earpieces that were just becoming available to law enforcement. All targets are in place. Stay alert. Remember, we don't move until they draw weapons. We need evidence of attempt, not just intent. This was the legally complicated part of Morrison's plan. He couldn't arrest the men for simply being at the venue with guns in their possession. Alabama was an open-carry state, and having a weapon wasn't illegal. He needed them to actually attempt the assassination, to draw their weapons with clear intent to shoot Elvis. Only then could he charge them with attempted murder and build a case against the entire WCDL organization. But waiting for that moment meant allowing the situation to become dangerous, meant bringing it right up to the edge of tragedy before pulling back. It was a calculated gamble that Morrison believed would work, but that kept him tense with anxiety. At 6 p.m., Elvis arrived at the venue through a back entrance. Red West and the rest of Elvis's security team escorted him to his dressing room. Elvis was in good spirits, joking with the band members who were already there preparing, doing his usual pre-show routine. Agent Morrison met Red West outside the dressing room. "How is he?" "He's fine. Still doesn't know anything." Morrison nodded. "Let's keep it that way. I'm going to brief you one more time on what happens when we make the arrests." Morrison explained. The moment any of the 3 assassins reached for their weapons, FBI agents would physically restrain them. There would likely be a commotion, possibly screaming from audience members nearby. Elvis's security team was to immediately surround Elvis on stage, create a human shield, and be prepared to move him off stage if Morrison gave the signal. "What if shots are fired?" Red asked. "Then the sharpshooters will respond, and you get Elvis down and off that stage as fast as possible. But I don't believe it will come to that. We'll intercept before they can fire." Red nodded, but his expression showed he wasn't entirely convinced. He'd been in enough unpredictable situations to know that plans didn't always work out perfectly. At 7 p.m., the lights in the auditorium dimmed. The crowd, now filling nearly 10,000 seats, began to scream in anticipation. Elvis was about to take the stage. Somewhere in that crowd, 3 men were preparing to kill him, and dozens of FBI agents were preparing to stop them. Morrison keyed his radio. "This is it. All units, final positions, weapons hot. Remember, we wait for them to move first, but we don't let them fire. The moment they draw, we take them down. Good luck, everyone."
At 7:15 p.m., the opening band finished their set. The lights went down completely. The crowd's screaming reached a fever pitch. Elvis Presley was about to walk out on stage in front of 10,000 people, 3 of whom wanted him dead. Backstage, Elvis took a deep breath, shook out his hands the way he always did before performing, and smiled at his band. "Let's give him a good show, boys." He had no idea that Red West was watching him with an anxiety that had nothing to do with performance. No idea that FBI agents throughout the audience were scanning the crowd, hands hovering near concealed weapons. no idea that his life was in more danger at this moment than it had ever been. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, Birmingham, Alabama, please welcome Elvis Presley." The crowd exploded. Teenagers screamed, jumped, waved their arms. Elvis walked out on stage in his signature style, confident, charismatic, ready to perform. The spotlight hit him, making him clearly visible from every section of the auditorium. In Section C, James Tucker sat forward slightly in his seat. Under his jacket, his hand moved toward the revolver tucked in his waistband. Agent Patterson, 3 rows behind, saw the movement immediately. He keyed his radio. "Target 1 is moving. Stand by." In Section A, Robert Mills was also sitting forward, his hand near his jacket. Agent Rodriguez whispered into his radio, "Target 2 showing indication, ready to move." In Section B, Carl Henderson was the most obvious. He was visibly nervous, his leg bouncing, his hand repeatedly touching his jacket where the gun was concealed. Agent Thompson was positioned directly behind him, close enough to reach out and grab him within a second. Elvis launched into his first song, Heartbreak Hotel. The crowd sang along, completely absorbed in the performance, unaware of the drama unfolding around them. Elvis was in his element, moving, performing, connecting with his audience the way only he could. In the FBI command position at the back of the auditorium, Agent Morrison watched through binoculars, tracking all 3 assassins simultaneously. All targets are showing nervous behavior, hands near weapons but no draw yet. Everyone hold position. The first song ended to thunderous applause. Elvis smiled, waved, soaked in the adulation. He launched immediately into his second song, All Shook Up. The crowd went even wilder, teenage girls in the front rows reaching toward the stage screaming his name. Tucker, Mills, and Henderson all shifted in their seats. Morrison could see their body language changing, tensing. They were preparing. "Second song," Morrison said to his radio. "Next song is the target. Everyone ready, we move the moment they draw, not before." Red West stood in the stage wings, watching Elvis perform, but also watching the audience, trying to spot FBI agents, trying to see if anything looked wrong. His stomach was in knots. Every second felt like an hour. The second song ended. Elvis took a breath, wiped his forehead, smiled at the crowd. "Y'all having a good time tonight?" The crowd roared approval. "Good, good. Now I'm going to do a song for you that I think you might recognize." The band started the opening riff of Hound Dog. The crowd went absolutely insane. This was the song everyone came to see, the song that defined Elvis at this moment in his career. In Section C, James Tucker stood up. "Target 1 standing," Agent Patterson barked into his radio. His hand went to his concealed weapon. In Section A, Robert Mills was also standing up. Agent Rodriguez whispered into his radio, "Target 2 showing indication, ready to move." In Section B, Carl Henderson was the most obvious. He was visibly nervous, his leg bouncing, his hand repeatedly touching his jacket where the gun was concealed. Agent Thompson was positioned directly behind him, close enough to reach out and grab him within a second. Elvis launched into his first verse, completely absorbed in the performance, moving, performing, connecting with his audience the way only he could. The spotlight hit him, making him clearly visible from every section of the auditorium. Tucker reached under his jacket. "Target 1 reaching, moving to intercept." Patterson was already in motion, pushing past other audience members, rushing toward Tucker. Mills' hand also went under his jacket. "Target 2 reaching, intercept." Rodriguez launched himself over the row of seats in front of him. Henderson pulled his revolver out from under his jacket. The gun was visible, in his hand, coming up toward Elvis on stage. "Gun! Target 3 has gun drawn!" Agent Thompson didn't wait for more authorization. He lunged forward, reaching over the seat, grabbing Henderson's arm just as it was coming up. The gun went off. The sound of the gunshot was barely audible over the music and the screaming crowd. Most people didn't hear it. but Agent Thompson felt the blast, felt the hot discharge from the muzzle as the gun fired while he was grabbing Henderson's arm. The bullet went wild, missing Elvis by at least 20 feet, embedding itself in the ceiling of the auditorium.
On stage, Elvis heard something that made him pause for just a fraction of a second, a sound that didn't belong. But he kept performing, kept singing, not fully processing what he'd heard. Agent Thompson wrestled Henderson to the ground. The gun fell from Henderson's hand, clattering onto the floor. People nearby were starting to realize something was happening, were starting to scream, but their screams were indistinguishable from the screams of Elvis fans. Agent Patterson reached Tucker just as Tucker was pulling his gun from his waistband. Patterson grabbed Tucker's wrist, twisted it violently, and the gun fell. Tucker swung at Patterson with his free hand connecting with the agent's jaw, but Patterson didn't let go. He forced Tucker face down onto the floor, knee in his back, and slapped handcuffs on him. Agent Rodriguez reached Mills a second later. Mills had his gun fully drawn and was raising it toward the stage when Rodriguez tackled him from the side. They crashed into the row of seats in front of them. The gun discharged as they fell. This second gunshot was louder, clearer. People heard it. People near Mills started screaming and scrambling away. Elvis definitely heard it this time. He stopped singing. The band stopped playing. Elvis looked out into the crowd, confused, trying to understand what was happening. Red West was already in motion. He ran onto the stage, grabbing Elvis's arm. "Get down, now!" Elvis, operating on instinct, dropped to one knee on the stage. Red positioned himself between Elvis and the audience, a human shield. Morrison keyed his radio. "Secure the stage. All units, contain the targets. Get control of those weapons." FBI agents throughout the auditorium were revealing themselves, drawing their weapons, taking control of the situation. Local police who had been positioned outside rushed in through the doors. The crowd was now completely panicked. People were screaming, trying to get away from the commotion, pushing toward exits. It was chaos. On stage, Elvis was crouched down, Red West standing over him. Elvis looked up at Red. "What the hell is happening?" "Someone tried to shoot you," Red said, his voice tight. Elvis's eyes went wide. "What?" Another security team member arrived, and together they hustled Elvis off the stage through the back entrance. As they moved him through the backstage area and toward his dressing room, Elvis kept asking questions. "What do you mean someone tried to shoot me? Who? Why?" Red didn't have time to explain. They got Elvis into the dressing room and locked the door. 2 security guards positioned themselves outside. Elvis sat down, his hands shaking, trying to process what he'd just been told. "Someone tried to kill me?" "Yeah, someone tried to kill you." Out in the auditorium, FBI agents had all 3 assassins in custody. Tucker was handcuffed and being led toward a side exit. Mills was bleeding from a cut he'd received when Rodriguez tackled him, but he was also handcuffed and being removed. Henderson, who had actually fired his weapon, was face down on the floor with Agent Thompson kneeling on his back. Morrison surveyed the scene. The operation had worked, but barely. Henderson had gotten off a shot. If Agent Thompson had been 1 second slower, if Henderson's aim had been a fraction better, Elvis Presley would be dead. Morrison keyed his radio. "All targets in custody. Scene is secure. Someone get me a status on Presley." Red West's voice came back. "He's shaken up but uninjured. We've got him secured backstage." Morrison let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The operation was over. Elvis was alive. The assassins were caught. But as Morrison looked at the panicked crowd, at the chaos in the auditorium, at the bullet hole in the ceiling, he realized how close they had come to disaster. 1 second, 1 inch. That's all that separated success from tragedy. Within 30 minutes of the arrests, the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium had been evacuated and secured as a crime scene. The 10,000 audience members, many of them still confused and frightened, streamed out into the March evening. Local news crews, alerted by the police presence, were already arriving, trying to piece together what had happened. In Elvis's dressing room, Agent Morrison finally met face-to-face with Elvis Presley.
Morrison explained everything: the plot, the months of investigation, the FBI's decision to let the show proceed, the arrests that had just been made. Elvis listened in stunned silence. When Morrison finished, Elvis's first question was, "You knew about this? You knew they were going to try to kill me and you didn't tell me?" Morrison met his gaze. "Mr. Presley, I understand you're upset, but we made the decision we believed would keep you safest and allow us to stop not just these 3 men, but the organization behind them." "You used me as bait," Elvis said, his voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Yes," Morrison admitted, "we did, and I won't apologize for that, because it worked. You're alive. The men who wanted to kill you are in custody, and now we can dismantle the group that planned this." Red West, who had been silent until now, spoke up. I knew about this. I agreed to it. I thought it was the right call." Elvis turned to his friend, betrayal clear in his expression. "You knew and didn't tell me?" "To protect you. If you'd known, you might have done something that would have made you more of a target, or you might have canceled, and then we'd be right back where we started." Elvis sat back down, his head in his hands. The reality was sinking in. Someone had actually tried to kill him tonight. He had been singing Hound Dog while a man was pointing a gun at him. If the FBI hadn't intervened, he would be dead right now. Morrison gave Elvis a moment, then continued. "Mr. Presley, we're going to need your cooperation going forward. There will be a trial. You may need to testify. And we're going to be investigating the White Citizens Defense League thoroughly, which means more security, more scrutiny on your life for the foreseeable future." Elvis looked up. "How long have they been planning this?" "At least 2 months that we know of, possibly longer." "And why? Because I won't say that black music is inferior? Because I respect the people who taught me to sing?" Morrison nodded. "That's exactly why. To them, you represent everything they're fighting against: integration, cultural mixing, the breakdown of segregation. They thought killing you would stop that." Elvis was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Did they really think murdering me would change anything? Did they think it would make people more racist?" "Extremists don't think logically, Mr. Presley. They think symbolically. You're a symbol to them, and destroying symbols makes them feel powerful." Outside the dressing room, Birmingham police were coordinating with FBI agents to transport the 3 prisoners to a secure facility. Tucker, Mills, and Henderson were separated, each placed in a different police car to prevent them from coordinating their stories. As Henderson was being let out, he shouted at the FBI agents, "You think this changes anything? You think stopping us stops the movement? There are more of us. We'll never let race traitors destroy the white race." Agent Thompson, who was escorting Henderson, tightened his grip on the prisoner's arm. "Save it for your lawyer. You're going to prison for a long time." The local news was already reporting the incident, though the details were confused and incomplete. Breaking news from Birmingham: shots fired at Elvis Presley concert, reports of multiple arrests, Elvis's condition unknown. Television crews were set up outside the auditorium, trying to get statements from anyone who would talk. Morrison made the decision to hold a press conference within an hour. The story was already getting out, and he wanted to control the narrative, wanted to make clear that this was a white supremacist attack, that Elvis had been targeted for his refusal to participate in racial hatred. At 9 p.m., Morrison stood in front of cameras and reporters outside the Birmingham Municipal Auditorium. Tonight, the FBI successfully prevented an assassination attempt on Elvis Presley. 3 men, members of a white supremacist organization called the White Citizens Defense League, entered the concert venue with the intention of shooting Mr. Presley during his performance. Due to ongoing investigation by the FBI, we were able to identify the plotters and apprehend them before they could carry out their plan. Mr. Presley is safe and unharmed. The 3 suspects are in custody and will face federal charges.
A reporter shouted a question. Why was Elvis targeted? Morrison chose his words carefully. The suspects belong to an organization that opposes racial integration and sees Mr. Presley as a cultural figure who challenges segregation. This was an ideologically motivated attack. Were shots fired? Yes, one weapon was discharged during the apprehension. No one was injured. The situation was contained by FBI agents who were positioned throughout the venue. Did Elvis know about the threat beforehand? No comment on operational details.
The press conference continued for 20 minutes, Morrison revealing just enough to satisfy immediate media interest while withholding details that might compromise the ongoing investigation into the WCDL. Back in the dressing room, Elvis was watching the press conference on a small television. He saw Morrison describing the assassination plot, saw the reporters' shocked reactions, saw the magnitude of what had almost happened reflected in their questions. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, burst into the dressing room. He had driven from Memphis the moment he'd heard the news. "Elvis, thank God you're all right. This is a disaster. We need to cancel the rest of the tour. We need to get you somewhere safe." Elvis looked at Parker with an expression his manager had never seen before. "You want to cancel? Let them win? Let them think that threatening me works? This isn't about winning or losing. They tried to kill you. They came within seconds of succeeding." "And now they're in jail," Elvis said, "and I'm alive, and I'm not hiding." Red West interjected. Maybe the colonel has a point. At least take a few days. Let this settle. Let the FBI make sure there aren't others." "There are always others," Elvis interrupted. "There are always going to be people who hate what I represent. If I let that stop me from performing, from living my life, then what's the point?" It was a side of Elvis that his inner circle rarely saw. Usually he was easygoing, deferential to Parker's business decisions, focused on music rather than politics, but tonight had changed something in him. He had looked death in the face and survived, and it had clarified what mattered to him. Morrison re-entered the dressing room after finishing the press conference. "Mr. Presley, I need to inform you of something. We're going to be conducting raids tonight on known WCDL locations. We're going to arrest Thomas Whitfield and as many of the organization's leadership as we can find. This is going to be a major operation, and it's going to generate significant media attention." Elvis nodded. "Good. I want people to know who these men are, what they believe, what they tried to do." "That's actually what I want to discuss with you. You have a platform, Mr. Presley. You have influence. The FBI would like your cooperation in making a public statement condemning white supremacy and supporting our investigation." Parker immediately objected. "Absolutely not. Elvis is an entertainer, not a politician. We don't take sides on controversial issues." "Colonel, they just tried to kill me because I wouldn't take their side. I think that ship has sailed." Morrison continued. "We understand this is a lot to process, but think about it. A statement from you could make a real difference. It could embolden other public figures to speak out. It could show these extremist groups that violence doesn't work." Elvis looked at Morrison, then at Parker, then at Red West. "I'll do it. I'll make a statement. But I'm going to say what I want to say, not what the FBI or anyone else writes for me." Parker threw up his hands in frustration, but knew he couldn't stop Elvis when he made up his mind like this. Over the next hour, Elvis composed his statement with help from Red West and one of his band members who had a talent for writing. At 10:30 p.m., Elvis walked out of the dressing room and stood in front of the cameras that were still stationed outside the venue. The moment he appeared, cameras flashed and reporters surged forward. Elvis waited for quiet, then began reading from the paper he held. "Tonight, 3 men tried to kill me because I refuse to believe that the color of someone's skin determines their worth as a human being. They tried to kill me because I respect and learn from black musicians. They tried to kill me because I won't participate in the hatred that people like them are trying to spread across this country." He paused, letting that sink in. "I want to say clearly, for anyone who's listening, I am not afraid of people like this. I am not going to stop performing. I am not going to stop working and learning from artists of all races. And I am not going to stay silent while others face the same hatred and violence that was directed at me tonight. Another pause. Elvis looked directly into the cameras. To the people who planned this, to the people who support this kind of violence, you failed tonight. You failed to kill me. You failed to scare me. You failed to stop what you hate, which is people of different backgrounds coming together through music. And you're going to keep failing, because what you represent is dying, and what music represents is the future. Elvis folded the paper and walked back inside without taking questions. The reporters erupted with shouted questions, but Elvis was done. Inside, Colonel Tom Parker was furious. Do you have any idea what you just did? You just made yourself an even bigger target. You just guaranteed that every extremist group in the South is going to— Good, Elvis said. Let them come. I'm done pretending this isn't happening. I'm done staying quiet because it's safer or better for business. They tried to kill me tonight. Me. And I'm not going to act like that's normal or acceptable. Morrison, who had watched the statement, approached Elvis. That took courage, Mr. Presley. Real courage. Thank you. Elvis just nodded, suddenly exhausted by everything that had happened. It was barely 11 p.m., but it felt like days had passed since he'd walked onto that stage at 7:15.
At midnight, FBI agents simultaneously raided 6 locations across Alabama associated with the White Citizens Defense League. The primary target was Thomas Whitfield's home in Montgomery, where agents found extensive documentation of the organization's activities, including detailed notes about the Elvis assassination plot. Whitfield was arrested without incident, though he immediately demanded his lawyer and refused to answer questions. But the documents seized from his home told the story. Meeting minutes, correspondence with other white supremacist organizations, financial records showing how the WCDL raised and spent money, and disturbingly, a list of other targets they were considering for direct action. Among the other names on that list were several black civil rights leaders, a white minister who supported integration, 2 journalists who had written favorably about desegregation, and 3 other entertainers, all white performers who featured black musicians in their acts or who had publicly expressed support for civil rights. Elvis Presley had been at the top of the list, marked as Priority 1 with a note, Most Visible Race Traitor, Maximum Symbolic Impact. Agent Morrison reviewed these documents in the early morning hours of March 18th and felt a chill. This wasn't just about Elvis. This was an organization planning multiple acts of terrorism. If they had succeeded in Birmingham, there would have been more attacks, more violence, possibly more deaths. By dawn, the FBI had arrested 14 members of the WCDL leadership, seized weapons caches from 3 different locations, and frozen the organization's bank accounts. It was one of the most successful operations against domestic terrorism in FBI history to that point. But Morrison knew the work was just beginning. They had to build airtight cases against all the defendants, had to prepare for trials that would likely last months, had to continue investigating the WCDL's connections to other extremist groups. And they had to protect Elvis Presley, who had just painted an even bigger target on himself with his public statement. Morrison called Elvis's hotel room at 8 a.m. Red West answered. How is he? Finally sleeping. It took him hours to come down from the adrenaline. We need to discuss security going forward. We found a target list at Whitfield's house. Elvis was on it, but so were others. This organization was planning more attacks. Red West swore under his breath. How long does Elvis need protection? Indefinitely. At least until we're certain the WCDL is completely dismantled and there's no one planning retaliation. He's not going to want to live with FBI agents following him everywhere. He may not have a choice. Mr. West, I'm going to be blunt with you. Elvis's statement last night was brave, but it was also dangerous. He's now the most visible opponent of white supremacy in American entertainment. That makes him valuable as a symbol, but also vulnerable as a target. Red was quiet for a moment. I'll talk to him when he wakes up. At 10 a.m., Elvis woke up to find his hotel room surrounded by additional security. FBI agents were positioned in the hallway, in the lobby, outside the building. When he emerged from his room, Red explained the situation. Elvis's reaction surprised everyone. He wasn't angry about the increased security. He wasn't frightened by the revelation of more threats. He was resolved. If this is what it takes to stand up to these people, then this is what it takes. I'm not living in fear. I'm not changing who I am or what I believe because someone might want to hurt me. Over the next few days, the Elvis assassination story dominated national news. Newspapers ran front-page stories with headlines like "Elvis targeted by white supremacists" and "Rock and roll star survives murder plot." Television news devoted extensive coverage to the arrests, the FBI investigation, and Elvis's defiant statement. The reaction split along predictable lines. Civil rights leaders praised Elvis for his courage and his refusal to be intimidated. The NAACP issued a statement commending him for standing with those who believe in equality and justice. Black newspapers ran editorials celebrating Elvis as an ally. But segregationist publications condemned him. One Alabama newspaper editorial called him a traitor to the white race who deserves what almost happened to him. Radio stations that had already banned Elvis doubled down, vowing never to play his music again. The entertainment industry was shaken. Other performers who had integrated their acts or who had spoken out on racial issues suddenly realized they might be targets too. Some increased their own security. Others became more cautious about public statements. But there was also a wave of solidarity. Frank Sinatra, despite his previous criticism of rock and roll, publicly stated, "Whatever you think of Elvis's music, you have to respect his courage." He stood up when it would have been easier to back down. Little Richard, one of the black pioneers of rock and roll, gave an emotional interview. Elvis could have just taken the money and stayed quiet, but he didn't. He stood with us, and when they tried to kill him for it, he still didn't back down. That's a real man right there.
The trial of James Tucker, Robert Mills, and Carl Henderson began in August 1957, 5 months after the assassination attempt. It was held in federal court in Birmingham with extensive security. Elvis was subpoenaed to testify. On the day of his testimony, Elvis arrived at the courthouse surrounded by FBI agents and his own security team. Outside, protesters held signs, some supporting Elvis, others condemning him. The courtroom was packed with media, spectators, and law enforcement. Elvis took the stand and answered questions for 3 hours. He described what he remembered from the night of March 17th, which wasn't much since he hadn't known what was happening until after. But more significantly, he testified about why he believed he had been targeted. The prosecutor asked, "Mr. Presley, did you understand that your public statements about race made you controversial in certain communities?" "Yes, sir," Elvis replied. "Did that concern you?" "Of course it concerned me, but I couldn't stay silent about something I believe was wrong just because it made some people uncomfortable." "What do you believe is wrong?" "Treating people as inferior because of their skin color. Segregation. The idea that black people and their culture are somehow less valuable than white people and white culture. I grew up around black music, black musicians, black families. I learned from them. I was shaped by them, and I'm not going to pretend that didn't happen or that it wasn't valuable just to make racists feel better." The defense attorney tried to object, but the judge allowed Elvis to continue. "Those 3 men tried to kill me because they couldn't stand the fact that I respect black people. That's what this comes down to. And I'm not going to apologize for that respect. I'm not going to back down from it, even if it means people want to hurt me." The testimony was powerful and was reported extensively in the media. Elvis came across as sincere, principled, and unshakable. Tucker, Mills, and Henderson were all convicted of attempted murder, conspiracy, and federal civil rights violations. Tucker received 25 years. Mills received 20 years. Henderson, who had actually fired his weapon, received 30 years. All 3 would die in prison, never seeing freedom again. B.B. King, when he learned the full details of the assassination plot in the 1990s, gave an interview about his friend. Elvis knew what he was risking when he stood up for us. I don't think the rest of us understood how real the danger was, but he did it anyway. That's the Elvis I want people to remember. Not just the music, but the courage. The story of the 1957 assassination attempt reminds us that standing up for what's right often comes with a cost. Elvis Presley paid that cost, with constant fear, with increased isolation, with a target on his back for the rest of his life. But he also gained something. The knowledge that he had stood up when it mattered, that he had faced down hatred and survived, that he had used his platform for something more important than entertainment. On March 17, 1957, 3 men walked into a Birmingham auditorium with guns and a plan to kill Elvis Presley. They believed that killing him would strike a blow against race integration, would send a message to other race traitors, would preserve the white supremacy they held dear. They failed. Elvis survived. The organization behind them was destroyed, and the message sent that night was exactly the opposite of what they intended. Hatred and violence would not win. Courage and principle would endure, and the future belonged to those who stood up rather than those who tore down. Elvis made a lot of music in his 42 years. But on March 17, 1957, he did something more important than any song. He survived an assassination attempt, stood in front of cameras, and declared that he would not be intimidated, would not be silenced, would not stop standing up for what he believed was right. That's courage. That's character. That's legacy. The men who tried to kill him are forgotten. The organization they represented is extinct. But Elvis Presley and what he stood for that night lives on. Sometimes history comes down to moments, a second that separates tragedy from survival, a choice between backing down and standing up, a decision about whether to speak or stay silent. Elvis chose survival by refusing to let fear dictate his actions. He chose to stand up even when 3 men with guns wanted him dead. He chose to speak when silence would have been safer. And 60 years later, we're still talking about that choice, still learning from it, still inspired by it. Because real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's looking fear in the face and saying, "I'm not backing down." That's what Elvis did. On stage, under spotlights, with assassins in the audience. He didn't back down. And that's the story worth telling.